U.S. and Russian officials at meeting in Saudi Arabia today for extensive negotiation talks as President Trump pushes to end the war in Ukraine. Notably, no Ukrainian officials were part of those discussions. The State Department saying that the meeting is a second step to see if Russia is serious and on the same page. What would an end to the war mean for investor sentiment and the energy trade? Should we see a lifting of sanctions on Russia? Joining us now, we want to bring in Andrei Kozyrev. He's a former foreign minister of Russia, and also Patrick Haan. He's the head of Petroleum analysis at GasBuddy. It's great to have both of you. Thanks so much for taking the time. Andrei, let me just start with you, just in terms of what is your assessment of the talks that are taking place as we speak right now today? The fact that Ukraine is not involved, the fact that Europe is not involved, what does that tell you?
Well, unfortunately, I think neither Ukraine nor European Union miss anything. This looks like very, very empty. They call it preliminary or exploratory, but that's just diplomatic, speak. The talks with Russia, with Putin's Russia, without force, demonstrated force and even used force, lead nowhere. And the talks in Riyadh ended, as far as I understand, by comments by both sides. There are more comments actually in Russian press, but official also, that there was no movement. Russia stands on its maximalist demands and made no step even aside from that. And they created 4 or something working groups, but working groups on what? On what happens after the peace agreement. And maybe one to look how to reach the agreement or ceasefire, whatever. But that's just, a kind of blame game. The primes, the presidents might blame ministers for not reaching the agreement, and ministers in their turn create working groups to blame them. But from the very beginning, it was absolutely clear to me that Russia will not compromise anything. And they're supposed to compromise their demands for gifts or rewards from the aggression. That is how much more land they will keep, how much more restrictions like demilitarization they will dictate on Ukraine or no NATO. Some of those things already accepted by American side even before the negotiations. But anyway, only force. That's the language that Putin speaks at home, using force against his opposition and everything. And that makes their demands for elections in Ukraine so disgusting, so ironic that there have been no elections, free and fair elections in Russia for 25 years, at least. Yeah. So his concern with the legitimacy of Zelensky is just ridiculous. But that's what they do, they understand force and nothing more.
So, Patrick, I want to bring you into the conversation because it's important to note what Andrei is saying here was echoed by Vladimir Zelensky, who said no deal about us without us. Obviously, Ukraine not involved in those discussions. Given the lack of clarity about the likelihood of this resolution coming to fruition, how big an impact do you anticipate happening in terms of the energy market and crude oil specifically?
Well, look, I think there could be huge implications for the U.S., for Russia, if a deal does materialize. But to your point, it's not going to be as successful if Ukraine doesn't have an active voice at the table. If Europe's interests are forgotten, now the U.S. is assured that as these talks potentially progress, there will be room for Ukraine and potentially interest from Europe. And I think the Trump administration certainly could carve out somewhat of a victory here if everything goes well, if sanctions on Russia are eased. That certainly could put downward pressure on oil. And of course, President Trump has promised to lower energy prices. So there are huge implications. But the biggest question is, will Russia move forward? Will they add demand? And how successful will the talks be?
Andrei, how likely is a summit, is a meeting between Putin and Trump?
I can add something to the oil as former Russian foreign minister. I try to follow the oil kind of drama or play, and it's absolutely impossible to predict the curve of the oil price for even for short time, not to speak for long time. And if Russia is now trading oil with China and India on discounts, but still, and if sanctions removed, they will trade more, but that does not necessarily mean a lowering of the oil price, because it's a very, very tricky subject. And also what is important, that even if Saudi Arabia and Russia and all other OPEC or whatever concede to lower the oil price, then the oil industry in the United States might be hurt much more than Russian oil industry, which is established, and especially Saudi oil, which is cheap and high quality. So you should be careful what you ask for.
And Andrei, to that point, we are seeing some support in the markets here, at least today, for the crude market when you take into account the strike that we saw potentially at that pumping station in Russia. But going back to what I asked before, just how likely do you think is the meeting that we are going to see within the next several days, within the next week or two, between Putin and Trump?
You can have as many meetings as you wish, but that's humiliating for the great power America is. I live in America, and I'm an American taxpayer, and I feel very badly for my country, new country, to be humiliated, because Putin uses that. He scores politically back home and in the eyes of China and other countries of the world, that he talks equally like an equal, being a war criminal. He is war criminal. When President Trump says that part of Ukraine had been obliterated, it's exactly right. But who did it? Who started all that? Putin. Putin can call the war back, just telling his troops to go back home to Russia. So what's the point of those empty talks? For Putin, it's political gain. For America, it's humiliation.